you see it?
What am I looking for?
This says the broadcast is live. I think that means that we're good to go.
Okay, all right. Thank you, because you know that better than I do. I'm the print person, right, Ben? Denise Rolark Barnes, published to the Washington Informer and host of Washington Informer News, WIN TV. And I am so excited to have as our guest right now and today for our Martin Luther King coverage that we'll be doing over the next couple of days. We have Ben Jealous, a long-standing civil rights leader, activist, former president and CEO of the NAACP, as well as a president of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, organization of over 200 Black-owned newspapers across the country, and where he made a tremendous mark, I think, on the progress of the Black press. Ben Jealous, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. You know, Denise, I turned 50 on next Wednesday, and I will have known you for almost exactly half my life.
Wow! Wow! I wish I could say I was turning 50, but I have to
well, you look younger than me, so just that.
I just added a year 2 weeks ago, so you know how that goes. But good, that is wonderful. I mean, that just shows how far. When someone asks me, "Do you know Ben Jealous?" I'm like, "Really?" And I followed your career over the years. I'm really, really, proud of all that you've done. And now, you put, not that you haven't done that, I was going to say put pen to paper, because you've been writing columns and testimony and all kinds of things your entire life. But you're coming out with a new book. And it is called Never Forget Our People. We're Always Free, a parable of American healing. So since we don't have like all day to kind of catch up on life, let's talk about the book and give us some insight into this title.
The title was a mystery handed down by my grandmother. She passed away at 105 last summer. She was a Delta. She was co-founder of a group called the Pierians, very involved in our community, and sometimes she spoke in riddles. And this one, when I challenged her, I realized she was just repeating what her grandmother had said and her great-grandmother had said, and that didn't make a whole lot of sense because both of them had been born into slavery. And so I dug into DNA, I dug into historical documents, trying to figure out what this thing that was repeated down my mother's maternal line, from mother to daughter, apparently for centuries. My sister would go on to repeat it at college parties and stuff, where it might have started. And I figured out, it was a pretty remarkable story about the first woman enslaved on that side of the family. It's in the book. The purpose of the book really is to urge all of us to finish the work of Dr. King. People forget Dr. King wasn't assassinated in the middle of a desegregation battle. He was assassinated trying to end poverty, trying to unite all people, white, Black, brown, Native American, Asian American, against every line they used to divide us, to end poverty. What he understood was that poverty lives both upstream and downstream from racism. What he also understood was that racism was something created in the American colonies to divide people who kept rebelling together.
Mm-hmm.
So this book really goes through the history of European indentured servants, African slaves, as we were first identified. And then after the 1720s, 100 years into the American experiment, it became whites and Blacks coming together in ways that will surprise people. The biggest thing for me, I figured out writing this book, researching this book, Never Forget Our People, We're Always Free, was that my grandmother's grandfather and a former Confederate general, in a gap in Virginia between the end of Reconstruction and the start of Jim Crow, led a populist rebellion that succeeded in taking over the entire state government, the governorship, both U.S. senatorships, both houses of the legislature, in order to preserve free public education, something started by the Reconstruction government that the old plantation owners, when they were reenfranchised, were trying to kill. And in the process, radically expanded Virginia Tech, making it the working person's rival to UVA, as it still is today, created Virginia State, the first public HBCU south of the Mississippi, abolished the public whipping post, which was still in operation 15 years after the Civil War, only used for Blacks, and abolished the poll tax. And that last bit kind of blew my mind because of the implications, Denise. You and I we were never taught in school that Confederates and freedmen got together and took over state governments. Like that just was not, and simply it was because the Jim Crow governments didn't want anybody to know that, so they just erased them from history as a party called the Readjusters. But the other thing was we were always taught, oh, the poll tax was simply an effort to suppress the black vote. Yes, it suppressed 80% of the black voters in Virginia when it was woven into the state constitution in 1902. It also disenfranchised fully half of whites, the poorer one half of whites, the ones who had rebelled with blacks, not during the Civil War, but 15 years after the Civil War, much closer to that date. So the poll tax was as much about suppressing multiracial populist movements as it was about any grudge against black power during Reconstruction.
This is a fascinating history, and it seems as though the more we peel back the onion, the more it becomes, I guess, less black and white about our history and culture, but particularly our history in this country. And it's really a tremendous effort that you've done to be able to peel back the onion, but as it relates to your family. And I always say, if we all would just take that time and stop really thinking in our heads whatever we think about each other and really learn more about ourselves, we'll find that, like your book title is, we were all free.
Yes, no, and it's kind of interesting, right? Because I forgot, like my grandmother was cousins to Thomas Jefferson.
Yeah.
And all men are endowed with certain inalienable rights, including life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is like a fancy way of saying, never forget our people are always free, right? So there was those echoes, but the moment in researching this book, Never Forget Our People Are Always Free, when I realized that both Robert E. Lee and Dick Cheney are my cousins, man, this country felt small.
And that was what I was going to ask you, because now that you have shared that information with the public, you learned it yourself, and I'm wondering, again, now that the country still feels small, but how else did you feel about that when you learned that these were your relatives?
I stopped writing for a week. I didn't know what to do. And then, when I dug into this populist rebellion, this party called the Readjusters in the early 1880s in Virginia, and I realized that not only was my grandmother's grandfather's political partner a former Confederate general who would be written out of history in Virginia, even though he was Lee's protege and his favorite, because he helped lead black folks in asserting their rights after the war. But he also would have been seen as a war criminal by those black folks that he helped lead, because he had massacred an entire black regiment at the Battle of the Crater after they surrendered.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to sit and say, well, why would they team up with him? And I was like, oh, well, they were 5 years into the terror of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was also opposed to populist rebellions in the white community. They were clients, if you will, of the plantation owners. They were started by the other Confederate generals who were ruthless in how they treated the white poor, not just blacks. And so, in other words, my grandmother's grandfather made a very practical bargain. Like, if you've been fighting the Klan for 5 years, a war criminal starts to look pretty good as an ally if he shares your political objectives. Mm-hmm. In this case, working class whites, this man's workers, whose side he decided to join, were on fire to preserve the free public schools that radical blacks had started during Reconstruction, but all their children benefited from. And that was the common cause that drew them together. Man, if they could get along, if they could change the world by working together, there's every reason to believe that we can heal our divisions now, that we can find common cause in the interests of our children and just get on with making this country work better for all of us.
You've always fought for that in many ways through the NAACP, even NMPA, and even your work in the environmental movement. I think you've always talked about the bridges that bring us together, as opposed to, what's on either side that separates us. And as we look at Dr. King, where do you think we are today? What would you hope that your book the message that your book would give to people as we begin to kind of, as our parade theme is recapture the dream? That's what we're talking about. But to recapture that message from Dr. King's life and legacy.
You know what? One, excuse me, you hear me pulling out a cord because it says my battery's going to die, and that's I'm so sorry. But we are living in the darkest before the dawn. In the middle of each century, the American people tend to lose their minds. You can go back into the 20th century, 21st century, the 30s, the 40s, the 50s of this centuries tend to be hard fought times. But sometime towards the end of the century, we pull it all together. And so I just feeling we're going to repeat the patterns of history in that way. My grandmother, who was a social worker, she trained Barbara Mikulski as a social worker, is a very sophisticated woman in a lot of ways, would say, if you were coming towards the end of 400 years of white supremacy as the numeric basis of our democracy, you would expect a certain group of very conservative white people to be losing their minds trying to hold on to their privilege at all costs. You would also expect a lot of whites, like my father, to be like, great, finally my people got to figure out how to get along with somebody else too. And we're living in that moment. But the difference she would point out between this century or the 19th century or the 20th is that this time the numbers are on our side. When we had a New South before, it was always based on some temporary situation, like the disenfranchisement of former Confederates or being able to hold white, straight Democratic voters in the Democratic Party, despite the fact that the Democratic Party had moved on from their style of white supremacist politics. And so now there's every reason, I think, to be hopeful that we'll be able to finally create a politic in this country that's more like Europe, that's more like us identifying as a nation and looking out for our own in a way that extends beyond color.
Ben, this is sort of a side issue here, but I do want to ask, because the research that you were able to do, particularly on your own family, is how were you able to access that? There are a lot of people that are trying to get their family stories and they reach dead ends. Yeah. And you seem to have been successful to kind of weave through some things and make some discoveries. How much time and how did that research?
Time, whiskey, wine, like it took a lot, to persevere through some of this. But what I would tell you is this, on the Black side, be persistent in getting as much as you can. You can often reach back a little bit further than slavery itself, at least some branch of the family that was, freed earlier. For example, other parts of my family were in slavery to the last day, don't show up in censuses. Hard. And then with those, where you reach dead ends, the Black community, get all the DNA you can. I carry my father's Y chromosome, my mom's X chromosome. My maternal grandfather, though, carries 2 chromosomes that wouldn't be picked up in mine. So we got his DNA, we got my DNA. His maternal line goes back to the Lemba people of Sierra Leone. We learned a lot about that. My X chromosome turned out went back to Polynesia by way of Madagascar. It took 2 years to figure that one out. But friends at Harvard helped us figure that out. On the white side, and if you're Black and your family grew up in slavery, DNA or family lore or even records may show you ultimately to a European American ancestor. Right. A lot of information, and that information goes back. I mean, that was like a bottle of wine in Ancestry.com for like one night, and we were back into like the 200s or something because of Roman records and because of the Mormon Church's efficiency in connecting all the dots. And their databases are what's behind Ancestry.com. So, you just got to persist. And if you got elders who are not on your maternal line and they're not on your paternal line, like XXX or YYY, they're in the middle of the tree, get their DNA now, get their permission, get their DNA, and see where that takes you. It's really powerful to be planning a trip to Africa and know which tribe. I mean, as you know, we got Gina and the other researchers over at Howard have done a great job and they are always adding more African tribes and greater specificity. And other folks have done a great job with Native American tribes. And then occasionally, there were 9 slave ships that showed up in Virginia from Madagascar. and that DNA nobody had, but we found it elsewhere in the world. So you just got to be a little bit persistent.
Yeah, that seems like. And how long in the making was this book?
The DNA research started in like 2010.
Okay.
It was just persistent and over time. The ancestry research around the same. And then the real spark, I had a book contract for 2 years. They were about to make me give back the advance. I was in trouble because I had a bad experience with a ghostwriter and the money was spent. And 1/6 happened, and all of a sudden a little spark went off. And this is one thing I'll tell you, Denise, we all need to understand how we communicate most effectively. I was explaining Dave Chappelle to one of his nephews. Dave's my god brother. And that he was different than most comedians. He's like a freestyle rapper. He lives in the front of his brain rather than the back, because that's where freestyle rapping, for example, lives. And Dave, that's how he improvises. And then I all of a sudden realized that's where I live too. I'm an extemporaneous speaker because I have a bad stutter and I can't really read things. And so I've been struggling to write a book, and all of a sudden I realized I had to talk the book. And so I composed this book the way Frederick Douglass did his, through extemporaneous speeches. And I recorded them. In this case, it was COVID, so I just gave a speech to my computer, like I was when a kid. I kind of set up at my desk, a couple of bobbleheads, looked at them as the audience. The kid would have been teddy bears, and I just gave my speeches to my bobbleheads, and that's how I composed the book. I did 80% of the book in 2 weeks.
Amazing.
So when you're struggling with writing, be persistent, but also be creative and take a moment to understand how your own brain works.
Do you think that this book could end up on a list in some of like a neighboring state that says, this is a book that you should not read? Or do you think it'll go by make it through I forget the term that they use, but the test?
The governor of Virginia is like censors.
Yes.
I really hope it gets through. The censoring of the history about the readjusters is longstanding in Virginia. It goes back even further, like just to the eve of Jim Crow. And we really have to tell the story and really understand why it was that 15 years after the war, a lot of men who wore gray, who were white, and a lot of black men who wore blue during the war got together to take over the state government. It's urgent for all of us. And, it's interesting. I was down in Gloucester where the first rebellion took place in the Virginia colonies, and it was European indentured servants and African slaves. And the little town historical society, increasingly black folks come in because they have white ancestors on the Confederate monument, like whose names, the monument is a list of Confederate dead. And they found, an ancestor, a white ancestor on that list, and they're curious about them. I think we're reaching a point where all our families, not just the Jefferson family, for example, who was long in denial about Sally Hemings, but all of our families from places like Virginia are more willing to have sort of curious conversations about, and what you find is that people back then understood it too, and that the relationships were more complex than, say, Alex Haley depicted. The staring at a paragraph in a will written by a man who owned my grandmother's great-grandfather, who owned my grandmother's grandfather, knowing that he was trying to protect them because he also understood that my grandmother's great-grandfather was his older brother, who he owned.
Yes.
Blows your mind. And, and then recognizing that the son had the hubris to run against a white member of that family and beat him in an election. And you have to imagine that all the things are connected.
Yes.
Part of it is recognizing that these people share your blood must embolden you to think you might be able to beat them at the ballot box.
It's interesting because I had a conversation with a guy not too long ago who was talking about his white privilege. And I said to him, how do you know you're white?
You're always good for those questions, Denise. You spared me today, but man, you can make somebody just swallow their tongue. What did he say?
I mean, because he gave me the story about his family, and it just sounded like there was something that happened somewhere along the way that with his mom or his grandmother who was disowned when she got pregnant, and I don't know, but he didn't have an answer. He didn't have an answer. He just sort of allowed that question to fly over his head. But I know I left him with something to think about from Arkansas. But at any rate,
Well, yes, there's a famous white guy from Arkansas who just accepted that his family tree was probably more colorful than his white ancestors wanted to admit.
Yes, I understand.
Helped him become president, I think. Yeah.
So, how can people get your book? Are you, I know you're traveling, probably doing book tours and what have you,
So
but
tonight, come out to the Eaton Hotel.
okay.
Mahogany Books is hosting me. They're doing it though over here, and at the Eaton, not at the bookstore in Southeast. And join us. That's one way to do it. You can go into Mahogany Books and buy it. You can go into Busboys and Poets and buy it, or you can go on Amazon.com and buy it. But please order it. We're on a mission to make this a bestseller. We need everybody that can to order. Never forget your people were always free. I guarantee you it'll be a fun read. Chapter 1 is me training Dave Chappelle how to shoot because he's afraid there's a 1% chance a race war might break out in the cornfields of Southwest Ohio.
Interesting. Yeah. So, I mean, Mahogany is right around the corner. And from us, so I'm going to be down in that area this evening. So if they're open today, I think they're open Wednesday. But otherwise, we'll try to get to the book signing at the Eaton.
Eaton tonight, people will assemble starting around 6:30, and it starts at 7.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Ben, thank you so very much for joining us today, for sharing this new chapter of your life. What's next? Another book, or what's next for us?
Well, in a month, I'll be the executive director of the Sierra Club. So that'll be a big journey. Yeah, I'll be the first Black person to ever lead a green group.
Wonderful. Yeah.
And a group that's already the most inclusive, not just the largest in the country. So very, very excited about that.
Well, we will definitely be reaching out. We have a dedicated environmental journalist on our team, and I'll make sure you two connect.
Would love that. And you guys are really doing great work, and it's hard work. Thank you. Thank you for persisting.
My pleasure. Thank you. It's for the cause because, I've always been free.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. But it's important for us to own that, right?
Yes.
Sometimes in our own lives when we feel trapped.
Yes.
And you have to remember that God intended you to be free. He may have made that more challenging than he did for other people, but just figure out how to seize your destiny.
That's right. Thank you. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
All righty. Have a great one. Bye-bye.